The two officers sat stiffly in the courtroom, their uniforms crisp but their faces pale. They could feel the sweat forming at the back of their necks. Officer Brad Taylor stole a quick glance at his partner, Officer Mike Reynolds, who sat just as rigidly beside him. The air in the courtroom was heavy, thick with an anticipation neither of them had ever felt before. Their hearts pounded in unison. The door at the back of the judge's chambers opened, and every eye in the courtroom turned toward it. The bailiff stepped forward and announced, "All rise! Court is now in session. Presiding, the Honorable Judge Malcolm Hayes." The moment Judge Hayes emerged, the officers' stomachs dropped. Their eyes widened in shock. Their breath caught in their throats. It was him, the disabled black man they had harassed, profiled, and humiliated just months ago. The man they had assumed was a nobody was now standing before them as the judge who would decide their fate. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The irony of it all was suffocating. Brad's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. How? How was this even possible? They had treated this man like dirt, never imagining he held any real power. And yet, here he was, dressed in his black robe, his piercing gaze locking onto theirs. "Officers," Judge Hayes said, his voice calm but firm. "We meet again." The courtroom gasped. Then, silence. Brad and Mike felt like the walls were closing in. This was beyond bad. This was a nightmare. The judge took his seat, adjusting himself carefully due to his disability. He folded his hands in front of him and stared at them for a long, agonizing moment before finally speaking again. It was a cool autumn evening in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The sun had just set, painting the sky in soft hues of purple and orange. Malcolm Hayes rolled his wheelchair along the sidewalk, enjoying the crisp air. His hands gripped the wheels steadily, pushing himself forward at a relaxed pace. As he reached a small convenience store, he paused to check his phone. A notification from work reminded him about an upcoming case. As a judge, he often found himself buried in legal documents, but tonight was his night off. He just wanted to grab a drink and head home. That was when he noticed them. A police cruiser was parked across the street, its engine idling. Two officers sat inside, their eyes fixed on him. Malcolm felt the familiar chill of being watched. It was a look he knew all too well, the look of suspicion. He sighed, shaking his head. He had lived through this before. Being a black man in America meant always having to prove you belonged. Even now, in a neighborhood he had lived in for over a decade, he was being watched like an outsider. Still, he ignored it. He wheeled himself into the store, grabbed a bottle of water, and paid at the counter. As he exited, the patrol car's lights suddenly flashed behind him. A sharp voice rang out, "Hey, hold it right there." Malcolm froze, his grip tightening on his wheelchair. He turned slowly to see two officers stepping out of the vehicle. They approached with purpose, hands resting near their holsters. "Where are you coming from?" the taller one asked. His name tag read, Reynolds. Malcolm exhaled slowly. "The store. Why?" "Got a call about a suspicious individual matching your description," the second officer, Taylor, said. His voice dripped with arrogance. Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious? I was buying water." Reynolds smirked. "Yeah? We still need to see some ID." Malcolm considered his options. He knew how these situations played out. They didn't care about his explanations. They had already made up their minds. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. "Here," he said, handing over his driver's license. Taylor snatched it and inspected it like he was looking for something wrong. "Malcolm Hayes. That name sounds familiar." "It should," Malcolm said, keeping his voice even. "I'm a judge." The officers exchanged glances. Then Reynolds laughed, a short, disbelieving chuckle. "A judge? Yeah, right. And I'm the mayor," Taylor smirked. "You got any warrants, Judge?" Malcolm clenched his jaw. "You." "No, and you know that." Reynolds circled his wheelchair like a predator. "You sure you weren't trying to steal something?" "I paid for my drink. You can ask the cashier." Taylor held up the radio on his shoulder. "Might have to run your name, just in case." Malcolm's patience was running thin. "Is this how you treat every citizen, or just the ones who look like me?" Reynolds' smile faded. "Watch your mouth." Malcolm shook his head. "You don't even realize what you're doing, do you?" Taylor folded his arms. "We're doing our job." "No," Malcolm said firmly. "You're profiling me." Silence. The officers stared at him, their expressions unreadable. Then, suddenly, Reynolds reached down. "Stand up," Malcolm blinked. "Excuse me?" "Stand up," Reynolds repeated. "We need to check you for weapons." Malcolm's hands tightened on his wheels. "I can't stand up," he said evenly. "I'm paralyzed." The words hung in the air. Taylor frowned. "What?" "I can't stand." Malcolm's voice was sharp now. Reynolds scoffed. "Whatever. Hands where we can see 'em." Malcolm slowly raised his hands. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, humiliated in the middle of the street. People passing by stared but said nothing. Then, without warning, Reynolds grabbed his arm and yanked. Malcolm's wheelchair tipped slightly, and he had to grip the wheels to keep himself from falling. His heart pounded. Taylor chuckled. "Relax. We're just making sure everything checks out." Malcolm bit his tongue. He had power, real power, but right now it meant nothing. These officers saw only what they wanted to see, a black man who needed to be put in his place. Reynolds handed back his ID with a smirk. "You're free to go." No apology. No explanation. Just dismissal. Malcolm took his ID, his hands trembling. He said nothing as he rolled away. But one thing was clear. Judge Hayes leaned forward, peering down at the two men who had once humiliated him. "This should be interesting," he said. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Every person present could feel the weight of the moment. Officers Brad Taylor and Mike Reynolds sat frozen, their faces pale. Their own arrogance had come full circle, and now, the man they had racially profiled and humiliated was about to judge them in the most literal sense. Judge Malcolm Hayes adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, his piercing gaze locked onto them. "I take my duty as a judge very seriously," he said, his voice calm but heavy. "Justice is about fairness. It is about ensuring that no one, no matter their background, is mistreated under the law." He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle. "That being said, officers, I must ask you a question." The officers swallowed hard. Yes, Your Honor?" Taylor stammered. "Do you remember me?" Judge Hayes asked, tapping his fingers on the wooden desk before him. Reynolds's mouth opened slightly, then closed. His jaw tensed. He wanted to deny it. He wanted to act as if the moment months ago had never happened. But it had, and there was no running from it now. Taylor cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I didn't ask for an excuse," Hayes interrupted, his tone cutting. "I asked if you remember me." Another thick silence filled the room. The two officers exchanged glances, realizing there was no way out of this. "Yes, Your Honor," Reynolds finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Judge Hayes nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "Then you should have no issue recalling how you treated me." The weight of their own actions came crashing down on them. For the first time in their careers, they weren't in control. They weren't the ones demanding answers. They weren't the ones with the power, and it terrified them. Malcolm Hayes sat in his home office, his hands gripping the arms of his wheelchair tightly. The events of that night played on a loop in his mind. The humiliation, the anger, the sheer injustice of it all. He had faced discrimination before, but this time it felt different. This time, he wasn't going to let it slide. He opened his laptop, the blue light reflecting in his determined eyes. He began typing an official complaint to the police department, outlining every detail of his encounter with Officers Taylor and Reynolds. He attached the store's security footage, which clearly showed that he had done nothing suspicious before being stopped. Then, he added one final detail, his title, Judge Malcolm Hayes. The next morning, the complaint reached the police chief's desk. It took less than an hour for the gravity of the situation to sink in. A judge had been racially profiled and harassed by two of his officers. The department scrambled to do damage control. Calls were made. Meetings were held. Officers Taylor and Reynolds were called in and asked to explain themselves. Their casual dismissal of the event quickly turned into nervous justifications when they learned exactly who Malcolm Hayes was. But the damage was done. The case made its way through legal channels, and soon it escalated to an actual lawsuit. And now, months later, the two officers found themselves on the other side of the law, facing judgment from the very man they had wronged. Judge Hayes adjusted his posture, his expression unreadable. He had waited for this moment, but not for revenge. He wanted justice, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been treated as less than human because of their race or disability. Officers, he finally said, you are facing charges of racial profiling, abuse of power, and misconduct. Do you understand the severity of these charges? Taylor's fingers gripped the edge of the table. Reynolds's face was practically devoid of color. Yes, Your Honor, they mumbled in unison. Judge Hayes nodded. Then let the trial begin. The courtroom remained eerily silent as Judge Hayes flipped through the case files in front of him. The two officers sat stiffly at the defense table, Air lawyer whispering to them, but neither of them seemed to absorb a word he was saying. They were still in shock, still processing the nightmare they had walked into. On the opposite side of the room, the prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Danielle Carter, rose to her feet. Your Honor, the prosecution is prepared to present evidence that Officers Taylor and Reynolds engaged in blatant racial profiling and abuse of power, she announced confidently. Judge Hayes gave her a slight nod. Proceed. Danielle turned to the jury. The incident in question took place 3 months ago, she began, when these two officers stopped, harassed, and physically mistreated a man who had done absolutely nothing wrong. That man was Judge Hayes himself. A ripple of murmurs spread through the jury box. Let's take a look at the footage, she continued. A large screen on the side of the courtroom lit up. The security footage from the convenience store played, showing Malcolm rolling into the store, grabbing a bottle of water, and heading to the register. Then, the crucial moment appeared. Taylor and Reynolds stepping out of their cruiser, watching him, following him. The moment they turned their flashing lights on him. Then, the worst part. Reynolds grabbing his arm, yanking him, nearly tipping his wheelchair. The video ended. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Even the officer's lawyer looked uneasy. Danielle crossed her arms. Tell me, officers, does that look like proper police procedure to you? Reynolds clenched his jaw. Taylor shifted in his seat, avoiding eye contact. Judge Hayes leaned forward. You may respond. Taylor cleared his throat. Your Honor, we were responding to a call about a suspicious individual. Danielle immediately interjected. A suspicious individual doing what? Buying water? Reynolds scoffed. We were doing our job. Judge Hayes's expression darkened. Your job does not include profiling innocent civilians based on their race. Taylor opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had no response. Danielle walked back to the prosecution table, grabbing another folder. Let's talk about your past records, shall we? She said, flipping the file open. Officer Taylor, you've had 3 prior complaints of racial profiling. Officer Reynolds, you have 2. A murmur swept through the courtroom again. Judge Hayes took a deep breath, his fingers pressing together. Officers, you were given multiple chances to change your behavior. Yet here we are. Taylor's lawyer finally spoke up. Your Honor, my clients were following department protocol. Judge Hayes held up a hand. Department protocol does not excuse racism. His voice was firm. It does not excuse targeting a disabled man for no reason other than the color of his skin. The tension in the room reached its peak. Then, Judge Hayes looked directly at the officers. I hope you realize something, he said. You are not on trial just because you targeted a judge. You are on trial because you targeted a man who had done nothing wrong. It just so happens that this time, the man you wronged had the power to hold you accountable. The officers looked down, their faces pale. Judge Hayes tapped his gavel. Court is adjourned for today. We will reconvene tomorrow. The courtroom began to empty, but the weight of what had transpired hung in the air. As Malcolm wheeled himself back to his chambers, he exhaled deeply. This was only the beginning. The following morning, the courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back, their cameras flashing as Officers Taylor and Reynolds entered, their faces hard with tension. The weight of the accusations against them was suffocating. But their lawyer, Richard Calloway, maintained his composure as he prepared to argue their defense. Judge Hayes entered and took his seat. Court is now in session. He gave a measured glance at both sides. Ms. Carter, you may continue. Danielle Carter stood, flipping through her notes. Your Honor, we have established that the defendants had a pattern of racial profiling. Today, we will hear from witnesses who have experienced similar treatment at the hands of these officers. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Taylor and Reynolds visibly stiffened. The first witness was called to the stand, a middle-aged black man named Terrence Whitmore. He took his oath and sat down, clearing his throat. Before speaking, I was stopped by these two officers last year, he began. I was walking home from work, and they pulled up beside me, asked where I was going, and told me I matched a description. Danielle nodded. And did they explain what that description was? No, Terrence said bitterly. They just told me to put my hands on the hood of the car. I hadn't done anything wrong, but they patted me down like a criminal. Danielle turned to the jury. Sound familiar? The courtroom was silent as Terrence continued. They let me go after a few minutes, but I'll never forget the way they looked at me, like I didn't belong. Judge Hayes listened intently, his hands folded on the bench. Defense, do you wish to cross-examine? Calloway rose from his chair, adjusting his tie. Mr. Whitmore, did the officers use excessive force on you? Terrence hesitated. No, but did they arrest you? Charge you with anything? No, but that's not the point, Terrence said, his voice rising. They stopped me for no reason other than the color of my skin. Calloway shrugged. Perhaps it was a simple misunderstanding. Danielle shot up. Objection! This is not a misunderstanding, Your Honor. This is a pattern. Judge Hayes nodded. Sustained. Calloway sat down, but he didn't look happy. The prosecution had successfully painted a picture of racial profiling, and the jury was beginning to see the truth. The second witness was called, a young Latina woman named Maria Gonzalez. She had been pulled over by Taylor and Reynolds 6 months ago for a broken taillight. The problem? Her taillight wasn't broken. They made me step out of the car, she recalled, her hands shaking. They kept asking if I had drugs, where I was coming from, where I was going. I had done nothing wrong. Danielle leaned forward. And what happened after that? They searched my car without my consent. More murmurs rippled through the crowd. Taylor and Reynolds shifted in their seats, their lawyer whispering to them in hushed tones. Danielle turned back to the jury. The pattern is clear, she said. These officers have a history of targeting minorities, using flimsy excuses to justify their harassment. And now, they are trying to do the same in this courtroom, justifying their treatment of Judge Hayes as protocol. But we all know the tea. Ruth, Judge Hayes nodded. The court will reconvene after a short recess. As the courtroom emptied, Taylor and Reynolds sat in silence. They were beginning to realize that their usual excuses weren't going to save them this time. After the recess, the courtroom was just as tense as before, if not more. The prosecution had done a masterful job of exposing a disturbing pattern in Officers Taylor and Reynolds' policing. But now, it was time to delve deeper into the heart of the case, the incident with Judge Hayes himself. As the judge took his seat, Danielle Carter rose once more. Your Honor, at this time the prosecution would like to call our final witness. Judge Hayes nodded. Proceed. Danielle turned to the jury, then to the doors at the back of the courtroom. The prosecution calls Officer Mark Simmons to the stand. The name sent a ripple of shock through the courtroom. Taylor and Reynolds turned sharply toward the entrance as their former colleague walked in. Simmons had served alongside them for years, before abruptly requesting a transfer to another precinct. He had never publicly spoken about why until now. Simmons took his oath and sat down, his face unreadable. Danielle approached him. Officer Simmons, can you describe your history with the defendants? I worked with them for nearly 7 years, he said. We were partners for a time. And why did you request a transfer? Simmons hesitated for a second. Then he exhaled. Because I couldn't be part of it anymore. The courtroom went dead silent. Part of what? Danielle pressed. Simmons turned his gaze to Taylor and Reynolds. The profiling, the harassment, the racism. Taylor slammed a hand on the table. This is bullshit! Order in the court, Judge Hayes said, his voice hard as steel. Taylor sat back down, his face red with anger. Danielle turned back to Simmons. Please elaborate. Simmons nodded. Look, every cop gets calls about suspicious activity. But these guys, they never needed a reason. If you were black or Hispanic, that was enough. They'd say you looked like a suspect or matched a description, even if there wasn't one. And did you witness this behavior during the incident involving Judge Hayes? Simmons clenched his jaw. Yes. A wave of murmurs spread across the room. Explain what you saw, Danielle said. Simmons sat up straighter. I was driving past the scene when I saw Taylor and Reynolds with their lights on pulling someone over. I stopped to assist, but when I saw who it was, I knew something was off. I recognized Judge Hayes. I'd seen him around before, but these two had no idea who they were dealing with. He shook his head. They were treating him like a suspect, aggressive, pulling at him. And when I tried to step in, Taylor told me to mind my business. Danielle turned to the jury. And did Judge Hayes do anything that warranted a stop? Nothing at all, Simmons said firmly. It was racial profiling, plain and simple. A heavy silence filled the courtroom. Taylor and Reynolds looked pale. Judge Hayes took a deep breath before speaking. We will reconvene tomorrow. Court is adjourned. As the gavel slammed down, Taylor and Reynolds exchanged a glance, one that carried the weight of their sinking fate, but the fight wasn't over yet. The next morning, the courtroom was filled with an air of anticipation. The prosecution had laid out a strong case, but now it was time for the defense to respond. Officers Taylor and Reynolds sat rigidly at their table, their lawyer, Richard Calloway, flipping through his notes with forced confidence. As Judge Hayes entered, the room fell silent. Court is now in session, he announced. Defense, you may proceed. Calloway stood and adjusted his tie. Your Honor, the prosecution has painted my clients as racist villains, but the reality is far more complicated. Danielle Carter crossed her arms, unimpressed. The jury watched him carefully. Calloway turned toward Taylor. Officer Taylor, can you describe the events of that night in your own words? Taylor cleared his throat. We were responding to a call about a suspicious individual near the convenience store. When we arrived, we saw the man in the wheelchair leaving the store. Given the description we received, we had reasonable suspicion to investigate. Danielle immediately objected. Objection! What description? There was no actual suspect reported. Judge Hayes turned to Taylor. Officer, answer the question. What exactly was the description you received? Taylor hesitated. It was vague. A black male in dark clothing. Danielle scoffed. So, any black man in dark clothing was a suspect? Reynolds jumped in. We were just doing our jobs. It had nothing to do with race. Calloway quickly interjected. My clients acted within police protocol. They had to ensure public safety. Danielle smirked. Let's talk about protocol, because based on the testimony we've heard, your clients have a habit of targeting minorities with no valid reason. Judge Hayes leaned forward. Officer Taylor, when you approached me that night, did you believe I had committed a crime? Taylor swallowed hard. We didn't know who you were, Your Honor. That's not what I asked. Hayes's voice was sharp. Did you have any evidence that I had committed a crime? Taylor opened his mouth, then closed it. The silence was deafening. Danielle let the moment stretch before speaking. Your Honor, I moved to enter into evidence the police radio logs from that night. Judge Hayes nodded. Proceed. A clerk brought forward a printed transcript of the dispatch recordings. Danielle held it up. According to these records, there was no active report of a crime in the area when the officers stopped Judge Hayes. The call they claim to have received? It doesn't exist. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Taylor and Reynolds exchanged panicked glances. Their lawyer looked like he had swallowed a lemon. Danielle pressed on. So tell me, officers, if there was no call, no suspect, and no crime, why did you stop Judge Hayes? Neither of them had an answer. Judge Hayes took a deep breath. We will break for lunch. Court will reconvene in 1 hour. The tension in the air was thick as everyone rose. As Taylor and Reynolds were led out by their lawyer, it was clear they were running out of ways to justify their actions. As the courtroom reconvened after lunch, an ominous energy filled the air. The prosecution had left the defense shaken, but Calloway wasn't ready to give up. He adjusted his tie, took a deep breath, and stood. Your Honor, the defense would like to call an expert witness, Calloway announced. Dr. William Grant, a specialist in police procedures. The doors opened, and a tall, gray-haired man in a crisp suit entered. As he took the stand, Taylor and Reynolds sat up straighter, hopeful that this testimony could salvage their case. Danielle, however, remained unfazed. She had seen this tactic before. Calloway turned to Dr. Grant. In your expert opinion, did officers Taylor and Reynolds act in accordance with standard police protocol? Dr. Grant cleared his throat. Based on my review of the case, the officers acted within reason given the circumstances. Danielle immediately objected. Your Honor, this witness is testifying based on incomplete information. Before Judge Hayes could respond, a commotion erupted at the back of the courtroom. The doors burst open, and someone walked in with evidence that would change everything. As the courtroom turned toward the entrance, a woman in a navy blue suit strode in, holding a thick folder of documents. She had a determined look in her eyes, the kind that sent shivers down the spine of anyone in her path. Judge Hayes adjusted his glasses. "And who might you be?" The woman stopped at the prosecution's table, handed Danielle Carter the folder, then turned to address the court. "My name is Detective Lisa Monroe, Internal Affairs. I have newly obtained evidence regarding Officers Taylor and Reynolds." Taylor and Reynolds stiffened. Their lawyer, Calloway, stood up immediately. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The prosecution cannot introduce last-minute evidence without proper disclosure." Judge Hayes held up a hand. "Ms. Carter, is this truly new evidence?" Danielle flipped open the folder and skimmed through the contents. Her eyes widened. "Yes, Your Honor. This information was only just obtained, and it is directly relevant to this case." Hayes nodded. "Then proceed." Monroe turned toward the jury. "Over the past week, we have been reviewing body camera footage and digital logs from the defendant's patrol cars. What we found is damning." Danielle stood, taking over. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what you are about to hear will remove any doubt about the defendant's intentions on the night in question." The clerk rolled out a monitor as Monroe inserted a flash drive. The screen flickered to life, showing dashcam footage from Taylor and Reynolds' squad car. The audio played loud and clear. "Another one, always the same." Reynolds' voice. He was chuckling. Taylor responded, "Yeah, they're all the same. Let's have some fun." The video showed them tailing a vehicle before flipping on their lights. A few moments later, the footage revealed Judge Hayes' car pulling over. The courtroom was dead silent. Danielle turned to the jury. "Not only does this prove they had no real reason for the stop, but it shows their intent, targeting someone because of race, for their own amusement." Calloway shot to his feet. "This is taken out of context." Judge Hayes slammed his gavel. "Enough. The jury will determine how they interpret this evidence." Reynolds turned to Taylor, his face twisted in panic. "You said the cameras were off." Taylor's eyes darted wildly around the room. I don't know how they got that." Monroe smirked. "Technology is a tricky thing, officer." Danielle walked toward the defense table. "Officers Taylor and Reynolds, do you deny this is your voice?" Neither officer responded. "I'll ask again. Do you deny this is your voice?" Reynolds exhaled sharply. "No." A gasp spread through the courtroom. Danielle turned to the jury. "There you have it. Direct proof of racial profiling and intent to harass an innocent man who, as fate would have it, was the very judge presiding over this case." Judge Hayes let the silence stretch before speaking. "We will reconvene tomorrow morning for closing arguments. Court is adjourned." As the gavel slammed down, Taylor and Reynolds sat frozen in their seats. Their defense was crumbling, and now there was no escaping the truth. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. The tension in the air was thick as everyone prepared for the final showdown. This was it, closing arguments, the last chance for both sides to sway the jury. Judge Hayes took his seat and banged his gavel. "Court is now in session. Ms. Carter, you may proceed with your closing argument." Danielle Carter stood and walked toward the jury, her expression unwavering. She let the silence linger for a moment before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have spent the past few days hearing testimony, watching video evidence, and uncovering a dark truth about the officers who were sworn to protect and serve. Officers Taylor and Reynolds did not make a mistake. They did not simply misinterpret a situation. They targeted an innocent man based on the color of his skin, humiliated him, and now they expect to walk away unscathed." She paced slightly, making eye contact with each juror. "You saw the footage. You heard their words. Let's have some fun. What kind of officer treats stopping a citizen who has done nothing wrong as entertainment?" Taylor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Reynolds had his head down, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. "These men abused their power," Danielle continued. "But let's not forget this is bigger than just one case. How many others have they harassed? How many times have they done this without consequence? How many people were stopped, searched, or worse, without anyone to hold them accountable?" She let the question hang in the air. "Today, you have the power to say, enough. You have the power to show that no one is above the law, not even those who wear a badge." Danielle took a deep breath. I ask you to find the defendants guilty, not just for Judge Hayes, but for every innocent person they have ever targeted. With that, she returned to her seat. Calloway sighed heavily and stood. He straightened his tie and walked toward the jury, wearing a carefully rehearsed look of sincerity. My clients are not perfect men, he admitted. But does imperfection make them criminals? I ask you to consider the circumstances. Officers Taylor and Reynolds were doing their jobs. They received a call about a suspicious person, and they investigated. Danielle rolled her eyes. The jury was unconvinced. Calloway pressed on. Did they make mistakes? Possibly, but should we ruin their lives over one bad call? They have families, they have careers. Do we destroy them over this? He let the courtroom sit in silence before nodding. I trust you will make the right decision. As he sat down, Taylor and Reynolds looked at him with desperation. It was clear even they knew his words had fallen flat. Judge Hayes turned to the jury. You will now deliberate. The jurors filed out of the room. The waiting began. Minutes turned into hours. Taylor and Reynolds sat rigid, their hands clenched into fists. The courtroom was silent except for the occasional whispers between attorneys and onlookers. Then, after 3 hours, the door opened. The jury had reached a verdict. Everyone stood as the foreperson handed a piece of paper to the bailiff, who then gave it to Judge Hayes. He unfolded it, scanning the words before looking up. In the case of officers Taylor and Reynolds, on the charge of racial profiling and misconduct, he paused, letting the tension stretch. Taylor held his breath. Reynolds squeezed his eyes shut. The next words sealed their fate. Judge Hayes cleared his throat. On the charge of racial profiling and misconduct, the jury finds the defendants. He paused again, scanning the room. The air felt electric, as if everyone in the courtroom had stopped breathing. Guilty. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Taylor's face went pale, his mouth opening and closing, as if searching for words. Reynolds slumped in his chair, his hands trembling. Order! Judge Hayes K. led out, banging his gavel as murmurs filled the courtroom. The jurors remained solemn, their decision final. Taylor shot up. This is ridiculous! We're cops! This is our job! Judge Hayes glared at him. Your job is to serve and protect, not to harass and degrade. Reynolds gritted his teeth. This is a setup. A damn setup. Judge Hayes remained unfazed. The evidence presented speaks for itself. Officers Taylor and Reynolds, you have been found guilty of misconduct and racial profiling. Sentencing will take place in 1 week. Danielle Carter exhaled, relief washing over her face. The courtroom erupted in quiet murmurs of approval. The people who had been watching, many of whom had likely faced similar injustice, finally saw accountability in action. As Taylor and Reynolds were escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, they cast one last glance at Judge Hayes. But he wasn't looking at them. He was looking at the system, at what had been, and what needed to change. Justice had been served.